So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here at Stanford. I was just remembering I got my MPH at Berkeley about 10 years ago, and I thought policy was one of the reasons I did my MPH when I was well along my career as a journalist. That career has now ended, and the thing that I did on the side with healthcare has now taken over my life. But the best course I took, I was just saying, the best course I took at Berkeley was health economics and policy, and I learned these very basic concepts which all of you are well versed in. But my favorite one was the marginal utility curve, which, it's like a little bit of access to something is great, like healthcare. But if you have too much healthcare, like too much screening, it actually starts to go down. It's a net negative. And the way I always thought about that was I called it the pizza curve. One slice of pizza is great. 2 slices are pretty good. But by the time you're in the fifth or sixth slice, you're actually it's worse than when you started. And those basic principles still stick with me and resonate with me in my everyday work. So thank you to health policy and economics. So one slice of economics that I wanted to start from was the Wanamaker problem, which is a little different than the title I gave you, but I've been thinking about the Wanamaker problem a lot recently. It's a bit of a trope in marketing and advertising and markets. But John Wanamaker, some of you will know this, and it's a cliche, so forgive me. But other ones, you'll think I'm smart. But John Wanamaker ran this department store in New York City, where actually I worked around the corner from there, that building, when I was at the Village Voice 25 years ago. He had this famous quote, which was 50% of half of the money I spend on advertising is wasted, but I don't know which half, right? That's the Wanamaker problem. And that was famously solved by Google when they created their AdSense, right? So you could actually understand in a very nuanced and granular sense what is working and what is not in advertising. So the Wanamaker problem, it turns out, is not just does not just afflict advertising, but it afflicts other areas and industries such as healthcare. As Mark was just expressing, there's a lot of money and a lot of waste in healthcare, and in essence, all that waste is the Wanamaker problem in healthcare. So roughly 1/3 of healthcare is waste, which is largely care that is unnecessary, the marginal utility curve, where we're putting too much healthcare at the wrong resources, or oftentimes, and what I'm particularly interested in, what we're working on in Iodine, is medications and treatments that are not effective. So we're spending money on things that don't work, which is a particularly specific kind of Wanamaker problem in health. And so that's what we're trying to do, and I think the nice thing about the way Mark is constructed today is I'm able to talk to you about what we're doing at Iodine in a very specific micro sense of thinking about the Affordable Care Act and engaging in the opportunities and challenges that it presents, and then the rest of the day will get much more expert and nuanced. So I'm going to be talking very specifically about this one problem. How can healthcare IT really root out waste is the opportunity. Right, and a lot of what I've thought about and done at Wired and other places is kind of in this gauze of the future of medicine. The future of healthcare is going to be all fancy sensors and robots and all these cool toys, but really the promise of technology in healthcare is just to root out waste, just to fix on where the Wanamaker problem exists and how we can discern what works and what doesn't. And so that's what we're trying to do in our own little corner of the world. Our own little corner of $3 trillion, which works out to be roughly $75 billion of a problem. So medication is what we're specifically interested in. We're really interested in the consumer, the closest you can get to a true consumer experience in healthcare. As you know, one of the problems with healthcare, or trying to solve and address things like waste, is the misaligned incentives and the opacities and information asymmetries that exist. But the closest we get to a pure kind of consumer experience, I would argue, is with medications. We go to the store, we pay for them, we pick them up in that bag, and we expect them to work. But so often the time they don't work, right? If you actually look at the effectiveness rate, the actual probability of any given medication working for any given person is remarkably poor. So in depression, in chronic pain, in anxiety, in autoimmune conditions, it can be less. Your chances of failure are greater than your chances of success. And I should say that these rates are usual care, not clinical trials, because the rates in clinical trials are often higher, right? They're usually at least about 50% or higher. And that's because they're clinical trials, right? There's these perfectly constructed, very artificial, highly managed experiments where we want the drugs to work as well as they can, or the pharmaceutical companies do, in order to put them on the market. That is not to say that they don't have some benefit for some people, but in the real world, things get a little messier. And that mess is what we call real life, and that mess is what largely we haven't been able to grapple with well in medicine. Because it's messy, it's complicated. So we look at clinical trials, we look at the abstraction, and we cross our fingers that when we give that drug to any given person, that it will work as well, or that we will, as in the RCT, or that we will hit that kind of 1 out of 3 chance. But that only happens 1 out of 3 times. So how do we operationalize or think about addressing that problem? So what I want to suggest is that the answer is not more research into drugs. In some sense, the answer is not more drugs. The answer is understanding what we have now and better deploying the resources and better matching in a real person-by-person context what might work for what person. And you could think of this has been talked about a lot in terms of personalized medicine or precision medicine, where we think about this matching being guided by molecular markers or genetics, or some kind of secret pattern inside our biology. I want to suggest that there's another way to do it, which is just to ask people, what is your experience? What have you gone through? Did it work for you? What did you experience? What side effects did you go through? How well do you perceive that this worked or didn't work? And out of that data, which we can gather and we can structure, that complexity, that messiness, we can discern better value and better matching. We can actually start to find what works, which is the mission statement of our company, helping people find what works. And I have to speed up, but the goal here is to engage people as consumers, right, not as patients. Patients, if you look at the Latin derivation of the word, and I'm at a university, so I can nerd out like that, but patient means passive actor, a passive sufferer, actually, which is fascinating when we expect people to be passive sufferers in healthcare, where in the rest of our world and our experiences, we don't expect people to do that at all. We expect them, in some sense, to have agency, and that's part of what we're trying to do. We're trying to give people agency, validate their experience, turn that into data, and use their experience as a catalyst, not only to helping them have a better successful treatment and experience, but help other people like them. So what we're doing, I would call, since I'm at Stanford, I can say this, we're forking the code, meaning we're taking, this is a trope from open source software, but we're taking what has worked in other situations and we're trying to adapt it for a new context. Specifically, we're taking validated protocols, the guidelines that these medical bodies have designed and very clearly mapped out algorithms for treatment protocols for using these medications and the treatment of these conditions. Starting looking at chronic conditions mostly, I should be clear. But those guidelines are then given to doctors and nurses, and the expectation is that they will then manually execute those. And the problem is that we only have so many people, only have so many providers in our system to manually execute those protocols. And so that becomes a very expensive, non-scalable proposition, or difficult to scale proposition. So instead, what we're trying to do, and I think what a lot of healthcare IT is trying to do, is to fork the code, which is to say, take these validated protocols and move them into software that have a high fidelity to the scientific background and validity on which the guidelines were developed, but to let software do the work. where otherwise really nobody is doing the work. Specifically, what we're trying to do is to map along, follow people's experience as they start a course of medication. So, is this all making sense so far? Okay, by the fact that nobody said anything, I'll say yes. So what we do is we use these instruments like the PHQ-9. That stands for the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, 9 being the number of questions. This is a protocol for the scoring of depression. So in essence, the screening or diagnosis of depression, you take this 9-question questionnaire, 9-question survey. You're given a score from 0 to 27. 27 is severe depression, and it has categories therein. And then you are diagnosed with depression or not. And at 15 or higher, the protocols would say that a medication is worthy, that it might work for you, or is justified. So this is a nice clinically validated instrument, which is important because it's a symptomatic condition, right? So for a lot of healthcare, we have clinically validated instruments that are based on blood tests or lab tests of some kind or another. For more symptomatic conditions, for behavioral health or mental health conditions, we can't actually measure that out of blood. We have to ask people. We have to ask them 9 questions. So asking people, the effectiveness or the kind of how well we conduct that conversation matters. We're trying to, in essence, have a conversation that creates a diagnosis. So this is the validated instrument that we're trying to really fork and turn into the basis of our software. It's a great example, I think, of the way the Affordable Care Act is starting to take these clinically validated instruments and create what I would call a liquidity or a liquid market around these measures. So what does that look like? We made an app. We built an app called START, which is for people starting an antidepressant. And the clinical guidelines for starting treatment of depression dictate a 6-week evaluation period. So in 6 weeks, if a medicine is working for depression, you should see clear evidence of that benefit by 6 weeks. So you have to wait, or you have to kind of evaluate over time. The problem is that in reality, that 6-week kind of frame gets, the patient leaves the door, the doctor's office, and they start taking their medication, and 6 weeks turns into 12 weeks, turns into 6 months. The person may perceive a benefit or not. They may not know that they have permission to go back to the doctor's office, and half the time they stop taking their medication. So the failure happens, right? As I said at the beginning, there's 35% chance that any given antidepressant will work, but we're not managing the inevitable or high probability of failure. So that's what we're trying to do with the app. So that little chart you see is the PHQ-9 score over time. So that's somebody's depression score. And we correlate that score, that clinical measure, with the human experience of the disease or of the condition, which is to say we ask them whether they perceive value, whether they're making progress towards their goals. We ask them what goals they might have. We ask them what issues they might be having. We try to measure and map the human experience as well as the clinical measure. And out of that, we start to create an understanding of the experience, the holistic experience of any given person. And in aggregate, we start to understand the experience of a population with some granularity, with, in fact, what I would argue is more granularity on the condition than might have ever been gathered before. We were lucky, a couple weeks ago, we were chosen by Apple. Out of the 50,000 apps in the App Store, they chose 3 to debut with CareKit, and ours was one of them. So we, according to Apple at least, we've done something right. But then there's the question of what do you do with the data? And just to spin through this, we think the benefit of this patient-reported data has value not just for the people in order to discern their own progress, but for the insurers who are actually on the hook for inefficient and expensive care, as well as for their clinicians who will be able to make more effective, faster, more rapid judgments, more changes in dose, changes in medication, et cetera. So that's the value, and effectively what we're trying to do is to help people find what works faster and drive that iterative process to be much faster. And I'll try to spare you the rest of the data and things that we're doing, but this is where the ASA comes in. This is where, for us, as a startup, trying to kind of surf this tide of clinically validated guidelines, it turns out, I would like to claim that we did this with complete understanding of what was happening in a regulatory sense, but it wasn't quite that preordained or preconceived. But it turned out that there was a lot going on that is well-timed for us. So just a few months ago, in January, the Agency for Health Research and Quality, AHRQ, put out a new screening recommendation for all Americans to be screened for depression. So not just put it with an emphasis on women, postpartum women, but the recommendation, the screening, was for all Americans. Now that stipulates then that insurers are on the hook to cover it. So that's a big change. That means money's on the table. That was a big thing that the ACA did, and hopefully for us. Next year, there's the expectation that the star ratings, so the CMS star rating system, dictates that depression management is going to be one of the ways that it determines how many stars Medicare Advantage plans get, and that determines how much money they make. And so that, importantly, is going to be measured by two metrics. One is adherence, which is how often somebody is taking their medication, which we measure. And the other is the PHQ-9 score. And specifically, PHQ-9 score as delivered out of the electronic health record. So you see what the ACA did here, what CMS did here. They didn't just want people to collect the score manually. They wanted to make sure that it was included and part of the workflow, the clinical workflow, out of the EHR, which is a really important kind of asterisk, if you will. So that hasn't gone into operation yet, but it's expected to hit next year. And then there's some other things, some other regulatory and industrial changes that are afoot that we think line up with this kind of shift. There's the whole notion of value-based pricing, which is to say pricing drugs on an insurance basis based on how well they actually work for real people, real populations, rather than what happened in the clinical trials. So when you move to value-based pricing with pharmaceuticals, you need to understand what that real-world experience is, which means you need to actually have an understanding of real people's experience in the real world, which we're collecting. So these are all the kind of shifts. And then just 2 weeks ago, Cigna, thank you, Mark, for sending this along, Cigna announced that it was moving to value-based pricing for its really expensive cardio drugs. So these are changes. These are all kind of these shifts that are happening because of the regulatory environment. To try to wrap it up a little bit, if you want to play this game, if you want to kind of engage in this world of metric liquidity, which you guys can share as a phrase, I give that to the world, metric liquidity. You have to pay attention to all these kinds of agencies and organizations, which is not easy because they do not communicate very well or clearly to the world at large. So you have to pay attention to HEDIS measures, which are created by NCQA, and you have to pay attention to quality rating systems, and the National Quality Forum also has input. So there's this whole ecosystem of metric-based organizations which are trying to create these kind of oftentimes patient-reported metrics. So it's complicated, is I guess what I'm saying with this slide. There's just a lot to pay attention to, and to take advantage of this kind of move to metric-based measurement and quality care, you need to be very cognizant of what's happening on a regulatory basis. As these things start to be considered, put up for comment, you need to get into the comment stream when CMS is saying we are considering using these metrics. What does the industry have to say? And believe me, they care how people react. Now, the reason I have an asterisk by PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. PCORI is more of a research body. It's the one organization that clearly you think is about patient-reported outcomes, but they don't really have as much of a regulatory impact as many people had expected so far. Okay, I'm gonna skip this. This is what we're doing in a broader context with the kind of ecosystem, but I'll spare you the play there. We think this kind of opportunity, the waste, specifically on a medication side, The waste is everywhere, and there are validated measures that correspond to all of these conditions that are on our radar as a startup. So for us, we're thinking, okay, this is our game plan, basically, is to run the board on these kinds of conditions. And thankfully, they're validated measures. Thankfully, the ACA is driving outcomes measures that start to incentivize people to gather these. And the question is, if I leave you with any one notion, it is this. ACA, in some sense, is forcing a move, a shift from manual collection, opportunistic manual collection of measurement, to automatic measurement of these metrics at scale, which means that's where software comes in. Just to leave you with one thought, the PHQ-9 is measured, and even though it's the validated measure for diagnosis of depression, it is effectively used in probably around less than 5% of depression cases that are people being treated and prescribed antidepressants because it's so manual. So even psychiatrists only use it about 20% of the time. So it's one of these kind of things that's sitting on the shelf that really needs to be deployed and used much more prominently. So these are the opportunities: patient engagement, actually measuring ROI, and this move to value-based pricing. These are the questions, and I think these will come up for the day. But for me, for us, as a bit player in this $3 trillion ecosystem, we need to know and we need to prove, is this big enough for everybody else to matter? It's not like when the White House funded a shift to meaningful use with what, $9 billion, $8 billion? It isn't that kind of shift. It's not that big. It's not that much of a land grab. We want to know, and we'll find out from our next speaker, I think, will this actually incentivize the insurers to move faster than they typically do because they are slow? And third, how does the value-based incentives for the providers, for the doctors, kick into this? Because that's huge for us. Will they actually care? All right, that's what we're doing. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sitting down.
Yeah,
sorry.
You've got to stay.
Don't
want to hear you, not me. So thanks very much for the presentation. This is an area that I've been interested in for a long time. I started doing research on healthcare in graduate school 20 years ago, and one area soon after I started that I got interested in was pharmaceutical treatments. This idea that it was then the most rapidly growing component of spending, and this question of sort of whether people should take any treatment, and if so, which treatment, and in what dosage amount, seemed like a very complicated optimization problem. And people pointed to FDA trials as, to some extent, like the way to assess what was the right thing to take. But I completely agreed then with what you just said, and I still agree now, that what matters ultimately is how it works in the real world. And the conditions under the clinical trials are often very different from what happens in the real world. Either people adhere differently, or the drugs expand to people who weren't in the clinical trial population. There are many, many limitations. So I think getting this kind of real-world feedback is terrific. And then additionally, a lot of researchers, people here at Stanford, myself included, will often try to use claims data to try to tease out what's working and what isn't working. But that's limited, and there are many things you can't capture in claims data that would potentially be, that you can catch here. So I think with the thing, at some level, we have this unbelievably large healthcare system. We have 323 million people, most touch it in the course of a year. And how can we get closer to each person doing what makes the most sense for them, given price and everything else, is moving the needle on that seems super important. So I guess one thing that I'm curious for you to give us a sense of, there are all these different diagnoses. You talked a bit about depression, cholesterol, and so forth. Where is the lowest hanging fruit in this area? Where is the potential for this kind of stuff greatest? And where are the places where, for example, it might be somewhat more difficult? And I could imagine areas like, let's say, Alzheimer's, dementia, this not working potentially as well, or for a treatment for infants potentially. So can you talk a bit about where do we, or can we make the biggest get the biggest bang for the buck initially, right, and then and where will we start? Will it get harder and harder?
So that's a great question. I think it depends whose buck it is. So for instance, we took our approach started with depression because as software developers, we wanted to look at what is the easiest, least amount of friction in terms of consumer experience to gather meaningful data. So asking people to, say, step on a scale or to get a cholesterol test is more complicated than just having them click 9 buttons, right? So, and we measure, every time there's an extra question, we can measure how many people we lose click by click, right? So we're very aware, and we want to hold that's why I have that slide on engagement is everything, because you want to hold on to people, because if you're losing people, you're losing people. You're not going to actually affect their health. So that was our approach, and there are other reasons why we started with symptomatic conditions. There are these nice validated surveys. There's a lot of messiness to the medications. The failure rate is very high, and the scale of the problem, 10% of Americans are on antidepressants, and they are responsible for about 25% of costs, and that is 300 million prescriptions. So it's the second highest, depending on how you measure it, the first or second or third highest volume of medications being prescribed. That's why we started there, and that's why chronic pain is next on our list. So it's kind of, in some sense, a public health approach. Now, if you are a insurer or an employer, you might want to start at the specialty drugs, right? Where that is the maximum amount of spend. Is if you're looking at pharma, you're not looking at generic medications. In some sense, you don't, not to be pejorative, but you don't care necessarily whether people are responding to those, because it's $4. So you might as well experiment a little, and there might as well be some trial and error. Ultimately, that will not serve you well in terms of long-term outcomes. But what your clear need is these drugs that cost $10,000, $20,000, $80,000 a course of therapy, and if that doesn't work, you're out a lot of money in a month. But the percentage of the population is very small on those. So there's a high amount of spend, but less of a population impact. So I think you just have to kind of, to answer your question quickly, or not so quickly, having spoken now, you have to actually work out the nuance of what are you actually trying to solve, and there, in each of those paradigms, I think there are low-hanging fruit or approaches.
That's great. And so, when you think about what care a person should get, there's sort of 2 questions. Should they get any care? And then which care should they get if they're going to get something? So take antidepressants. There may be some people who are taking them who perhaps shouldn't be, and vice versa. And then there may be some people taking one medication when they should be taking something else. Now, my guess is that as you assemble data, you might be able to help with prediction to figure out, given your characteristics, this drug is, you might want to start with this drug as opposed to this other drug, which is, and there's such huge variation across people in how effective the drugs are. So is that your hope, to get people sooner to the drug they should, but also, should you take anything?
Right. So ultimately, find what works faster as a philosophy means prediction.
Yep.
Right. So we are already able to understand, based on this has been up for about 6 months, and based on that data set, we're already able to say that when somebody indicates that they have so we look at 1-week correlations to 6-week outcomes, which is to say, at 6 weeks, are they responding to the drug? And in the first week, if somebody says they have a headache, that corresponds to a lack of success. If they say that they have trouble sleeping, that corresponds to a lack of success. But if they say the drug is worth it in that first week, that corresponds to a positive outcome. So this allows you to start, in some sense, stratifying the population and identifying in the first week where there might be needs for additional interventions on those populations. So when you're thinking about claims data, for instance, the payer doesn't have any window into that experience until two months into the course. So to create a insight into the 1-week window is huge. But in terms of whether the person should be on the drug at all, that ultimately that's not a problem we're trying to solve, or we can't solve at this stage, because we're, in some sense, taking a handoff from the doctor, right? So they leave the doctor's office, and then we're basically the drug or the software that goes with the hardware being the pill. So we can't, right now, that would be way too much for us to bite off.
Okay, great. All right, so now I'm going to open it up to questions, and remember that I had said at the outset that it would be great for some students, and I know there are at least a couple students here who are co-authors of mine and who I'm funding, so I'm going to cold call on them if no one else raised, so just to be warned. So let's see, do we have any questions of the student? There we go, right here in back. You're lucky, guys. I was coming.
So my name is Scott Fleming. I'm a student, a master's candidate at the medical school in biomedical informatics.
Oh, wonderful.
Glad to be here. Thank you. One of the concerns that I've seen addressed or brought up frequently is the idea that part of the issue with medicines is that it's traditionally been, effectiveness has been measured for middle-class adult white men. And so I was wondering how your app or how data collection, for example, will address that problem specifically and make sure that the distribution of medicine and its calculation of effectiveness is I guess, gene blind in a way.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think the fact that most drugs are tested and validated on disproportionately male populations it's a real problem, and it's actually especially fascinating and problematic when you look at something like depression, which affects 1 in 10 men, but as many as 1 in 4 women. So it's a very different in the experience of the condition. And this is all. I'm not a clinician, and I'm certainly not an expert in behavioral health, but I've learned a lot recently. And the way depression manifests in men is very different. It kind of trends towards, just to speak categorically, it trends towards anger, which is not the way that the condition manifests in women so much. So understanding those patterns is part of what we're trying to map, and actually having some insight into the nuance of how different populations have different experiences. Our interest is to have is really to map the experience of the condition, right? So to map whatever the real world kind of manifestation is on a population basis, and to have enough understanding and enough significance, enough sample size, to be able to say that women with postpartum depression kind of have these characteristics versus men whose trigger of depression might be a traumatic life event, say. And those are kind of patterns and experience or profiles that are starting to emerge out of our data.
That's great.
But it's early.
Okay, another question.
So the focus you had was on prescription drugs, right? Which is one method to treat many of these. So many of these, all there have things that have behavioral, what you eat, what you exercise, all these other things that have complicated, hard to identify outcomes, effects on the diseases, right? So those are much harder for individuals to know whether they're eating right or to correlate even for themselves. I ate this or I did this and I felt better or worse. Do you see a future where you're tracking not just outcome, other behaviors of individuals to identify the effects of those other behaviors on their symptoms?
Yeah. So yes, and I would like, I am not a computer scientist, so when we started this company, it seemed to me like, well, we'll just map everything, and then we'll start to identify and correlate the data to understand what the triggers and benefits are. But when you actually start to understand how that works, the complexity is it's exponentials of exponentials. So when you start, right now, for instance, we have a very clear constraint, which is we're looking at one drug or one treatment. It doesn't have to be a drug, it could be exercise, but it's one input to see how that correlates to the output of response to treatment. And of course, that's not how it works in the real world, right? People take combination therapies, they try exercise, they see therapists. There is a great deal of complexity to the treatment as well as to the experience. But if you're going to try to build a matrix of understanding, you need to start someplace. And and ultimately you layer in the complexity on a basically the algorithm can be more complicated. But you have to work your way up to that. And what we needed to make sure was that just this fundamental, the simplest way that the way we could simplify it and build something quickly and then test does that help people? Is that something people want to use as a piece of software? So that's where we needed to start as a startup.
Great. Additional questions? Right here, or Roger? Yeah. Okay.
So recently, I had my genome sequenced, and I was charged some money, but the real value by Illumina, and the real value to the company that did it wasn't that they could charge me money, a transaction. The real value was the data set, and they're going to charge in the future to query that data set. And by the way, I don't get my own genome sequence, even though they sequenced it. I get to I get the right now to query my own data set.
Yeah.
Is your business model similar? In essence, it's not that you're going to charge transactionally and make money by having insurance companies provide this app for them. Really, you're building a database, and in the future, you'll charge to query it, similar to Google.
Yeah, it's not quite that. I mean, in part, that's part of the model. I mean, I guess there's two parts of our model. One is the services model. So just having this population of patients with various conditions, so depression, et cetera, that are expensive and you want to manage as effectively as possible. And then the other is kind of the value of that kind of data set collection and finding what works and making that work better and better, and the opportunity to plan interventions and smarter kind of development based on that data. So it's part of it, but I don't think it's exactly analogous to kind of the genetic sequencing market. And I can talk about that more separately.
One more question right here. He raised his hand at the beginning, so. Yeah.
Thank you, Thomas. It's an interesting idea. I would encourage you to keep going with it. But what came to my mind was that the fact of the matter is this is a correlation with a patient feeling better, but many drugs have side effects. Mm-hmm. And an example might be chemotherapy, where when chemo is working its best, the patient feels the worst, right? And so I guess the question I have is twofold. One, have you thought about dealing with that paradox? And two, it would seem to me that big pharma would be very interested in detailed side effects, negative side effects being reported from these patients who are using your app.
Yeah, you'd think they would be, but they actually don't want to know oftentimes. So there's the whole adverse event reporting system, which costs them billions of dollars a year, which is fascinating, but I don't want to go down into that. But to your first, I'm just blanking on it. Your first point was, oh, right. So yes, so well, just to be clear, we try to collect a lot of issue data. So a lot of the side effect data. It's very important for us. Now, in terms of the paradox, there's this one awesome study that I point to a lot, which was done on two renal chemotherapy drugs, both of which are under patent, so they're very expensive. And they did a great study where they had it was somebody would know, it's a cross cohort study or something like that. They started a bunch on drug A and a bunch on drug B, and then they switched them and told them they were switching them. So the people who were on A got B. And then what they were trying to discern was, and clinically they were equally as effective, but what they were trying to get at was, what is that actual patient experience? And what they found was that what is actually usually the second line drug was hugely preferred by the patients versus the traditional kind of conventional care first line therapy. The question is, would that data make any difference to providers? Would providers actually change the way they do a course of therapy based on that patient data? And I'm waiting to see that data. Anecdotally, it hasn't actually. A lot of clinicians have said they're not going to change their protocols. So I think there's a whole world in which you need to think not only building the patient-reported care back, or the patient-reported outcomes back into the system as a data set, but just having it mean something to providers and be something that they can and will understand as a real signal to better care.
Okay, that's great. So let me just, thank you so much, Thomas. Let me just say, we're going to get box lunches and we're going to come back and eat at your tables. We're trying to have a compressed schedule today, be really efficient. So I don't really quite know how it's all going to work. Everybody box lunch, back to their seats, but we have a lot of people who think about efficiency in this room, so just trying to nudge things along. So thank you, but please join me in thanking Thomas Goetz.